There was a man who taught the world how to know when to hold on and when to let go. But it took nearly a lifetime for him to learn that lesson for himself. That voice, low, raspy, unhurried, never demanded that you listen. It simply existed, like a stranger sitting beside you on a late-night bus, telling a story that seems almost simple, until you step off and realize you've been carrying it with you for a long time. That man was Kenny Rogers. To the public, he was the gambler, a symbol of lived experience, a man who understood life, understood people, understood how to choose the right moment. But there is a paradox few ever speak about. The man who told the wisest stories about choice kept paying the price with his own private life. Behind the millions of records sold, behind the packed arenas, behind a voice that made people feel comforted, was a man who was always late to his own family. A man who triumphed on stage, yet was often absent where he was needed most. This story is not meant to glorify a legend, nor is it searching for tragedy to invite pity. This is a journey into the part of Kenny Rogers' life rarely seen, where the spotlight no longer protects, where the right choices in songs turn into painfully difficult questions in real life. And perhaps, when this story ends, the question that remains will not belong only to him, but to anyone who has ever gone very far, only to stop and ask, what did I trade away along the way? Kenny Rogers was born in 1938 and grew up in Texas, in a large family struggling with poverty. His childhood did not contain the kind of dramatic tragedies that forced the world to look back, but it carried something quieter, more persistent, a prolonged sense of lack. Not only a lack of money, but a lack of space, of privacy, and even of time to be a child in the fullest sense of the word. Living in cramped homes, Kenny learned early how to survive by staying quiet. When you don't have much room to speak, you learn how to observe. When you can't push yourself to the center, you step back and listen. That habit stayed with him for the rest of his life, on stage, in the recording studio, and within his most private relationships. No one ever taught Kenny that music would lead him to fame. At first, music was simply a refuge, a place to lean on, a way to express things that were difficult to say in ordinary words. He came to music not because he dreamed of becoming a star, but because he needed a way to remain connected to the world, a way not to be pushed to the margins by circumstance. That childhood shaped a Kenny Rogers very different from the image people later had of a legend. He was reserved, unshowy, without any desire to command the spotlight, always standing slightly back, close enough to observe, far enough not to be swept away. And from that position emerged a distinctive storytelling voice, not imposing, not instructive, but gently posing questions that listeners had to answer for themselves. That was the root of everything that followed. Before he became an icon, Kenny Rogers was a child who learned how to survive by listening, and he never forgot that lesson. Kenny Rogers' path into music did not begin with a clearly defined dream, nor did it follow a straight line. He entered the profession through trial and error, the way someone searches for a place to stand in a world far larger than his ability to control. Kenny played jazz, experimented with folk, drifted through rock, and eventually brushed against pop. Each genre marked a change in direction, not because he lacked identity, but because he had not yet learned who he was allowed to be. In those years, music was first and foremost a means of survival. He played to pay the rent, to avoid returning to jobs with no future, and to sustain a dream that was still painfully undefined. He faced rejection far more often than recognition. Bands broke apart. Projects went nowhere. Without early success to cling to, Kenny was forced to learn something difficult: patience. Patience with the market, patience with himself, and most importantly, the ability to adapt without losing his core. That very delay became his advantage. While many artists tried to make their voices stand out, Kenny began to realize a deeply personal truth. He didn't need to sing better than others. He needed to tell the truth more honestly. His first moment of real attention did not come from a flawless high note, but from the way he placed his words, unhurried, ordinary, as if speaking to a single listener. From that point on, Kenny Rogers understood the principle that would guide his entire career. His music didn't exist to impress, but to remain. That first spark didn't ignite into a roaring blaze. It burned quietly, steadily, strong enough to carry him forward through many more years before the world finally learned his name. The true turning point in Kenny Rogers' career did not arrive like a sudden explosion. It came slowly, in perfect rhythm, and once it did, it was almost impossible to reverse. In the late 1970s, The Gambler appeared. It was not merely a successful song. It functioned like a mirror. Listeners did not see Kenny reflected in it. They saw themselves, the choices they had held on to, the moments they were forced to let go, and the quiet departures no one else witnessed. From that moment on, Kenny Rogers was no longer simply a singer. He became a voice for lived experience, not someone standing above to explain life, but someone sitting beside you, telling it as it was. And that was precisely why The Gambler transcended country music, becoming a cultural symbol, quoted, referenced, and enduring far longer than most hits of its era. But The Gambler was not an isolated flash of brilliance. Before it, Lucille had already opened the first door, marking the moment when Kenny first made audiences pause and listen to a man confessing his loneliness. That song earned him his first Grammy, not as a reward for vocal technique, but as a recognition for a style of storytelling so honest, it required no defense. Then came Lady, a love song that carried Kenny beyond the boundaries of country and into the heart of American pop music. He did not change who he was to satisfy popular taste. He simply slowed down, singing as if he were making a promise to a single person. The success of Lady proved that Kenny's narrative voice could travel very far, as long as it remained anchored in emotional truth. When the duet islands in the stream arrived, Kenny Rogers stood firmly in a rare position, an artist capable of connecting generations, genres, and even listeners who had never considered themselves country fans. Awards continued to follow: Grammy, CMA, ACM. But by then, they were no longer what defined him in the public memory. They merely confirmed what audiences had long felt. Kenny Rogers did not succeed because he ran faster than others, but because he moved at a pace that felt human. In an America marked by turbulence, where music often became a vessel for anger or spectacle, Kenny emerged as a rare counterbalance. He did not shout emotions. He did not wound in order to impress. He told stories as if speaking quietly to himself, and in doing so, unknowingly gave voice to millions who had never found the words for their own feelings. That was the mechanism behind Kenny Rogers' success. Not explosion, but endurance. If the stage was where Kenny Rogers always arrived on time, his private life was where he was often late. The 5 marriages that passed through his life were not marked by loud scandals or shocking controversies. They ended in a quieter way, like rooms slowly emptying when the person who belongs there no longer has enough time to return. Relentless schedules, back-to-back tours, and the weight of being an icon gradually pulled Kenny away from the moments that most required his presence. Not because he didn't care, but because he always believed he could make up for it later. But family time does not operate by the logic of the stage. It does not wait for the lights to go out. His children became a mirror he could not avoid. In it, Kenny was forced to confront a deep fear. Was he repeating the very thing he himself had once lived through? A father who was always busy, always distant, always armed with a reasonable excuse for being absent? That question never appeared in interviews. It surfaced instead in quiet evenings, when there was no audience left to talk in place of feeling. Off stage, Kenny was a reserved man. He did not like speaking at length about himself, and he was even less inclined to justify his choices. Silent self-reproach followed him longer than any praise ever did. He understood human life deeply, deeply enough to tell stories that made millions feel comforted. But precisely because he understood it so well, he also knew that living fully within one's own private life was not always easy. Perhaps that was the greatest paradox of Kenny Rogers' life. A man who understood life well enough to speak the unspeakable for others, yet needed a very long time to learn how to remain fully present within his own family. The greatest tragedy in Kenny Rogers' life did not erupt in scandal, nor did it arrive as a public collapse that made the world turn and look back. It unfolded in a far quieter way, as a prolonged exhaustion, accumulating over the years, until even the man living through it no longer realized when the fatigue had begun. When Kenny reached his peak, he did not become famous alone. He became bound to an image, the calm, seasoned man who always knew what he was doing. Audiences loved that image, but it slowly turned into a suffocating mold. Because in order to preserve it, Kenny almost lost the right to be wrong, to be weak, to be lost like an ordinary human being. Each time his private life cracked, there was nowhere to place it, except in silence and by continuing forward. Kenny's marriages did not fall apart because love was absent, but because absence itself became a habit. It began with a few extended tours. Then came holidays missed, and gradually his presence within the family turned uncertain. There were no explosive arguments, no single moment dramatic enough to be called the end. Only a widening distance, where two people realized they were living parallel lives, no longer living together. Each failed marriage left a small fracture in Kenny, and the frightening part was this: those fractures were never healed in time. He threw himself into work as a form of self-justification, telling himself he was doing what needed to be done. But the more successful he became, the farther he drifted from his family. And the farther he drifted, the more he had to rely on the image of the man who understood everything in order to remain steady before the public. His health began to decline in that context. Not because of a single shock, but because the body cannot indefinitely carry a life without rest. After the lights went out, when the audience had gone home, what remained was not applause, but the very real loneliness of a man who had just finished telling stories to thousands of others, and no longer had anyone left to tell his own story too. Looking deeper, a quiet current runs through his entire life. A self-reliant childhood taught Kenny how to stand alone. Success that arrived late forced him to seize every opportunity, never daring to stop. And because of that, family, the one thing that requires steadier presence than any spotlight, was slowly pushed aside. Not because he did not value it, but because he never learned how to hold both the spotlight and a complete private life at the same time. The storm in Kenny Rogers' life did not bring everything down in a single night. It eroded things little by little, until he realized that some losses cannot be measured by public failure, but by the people who quietly walked away while he was still standing under the lights. The fracture point in Kenny Rogers' life did not arrive as a fall shocking enough to stop the world. There was no disastrous final performance, no scandal that forced him into retreat. There was only a quiet decision, made after many years of asking himself how much farther he could go. And at what cost? Kenny began to withdraw from the stage gradually, step by step, the way someone learns to loosen their grip on something that has defined them for an entire lifetime. Fewer tours, fewer appearances, fewer explanations. He made no grand announcement, created no dramatic climax for his own departure, because for Kenny, this was not an event. It was a matter of survival. After too many years of arriving late to his family, after too many moments of believing there would always be time to make up for it, and Kenny began to confront a very real fear. If he stayed under the lights, he might lose what could never be recovered. Not only his family, but himself, the person behind the voice, behind the stories he had told too many times. That decision to stop was not celebrated. It did not resemble victory, nor was it tragic enough to become legend. In a world where fame is often measured by how long one can extend the spotlight, choosing to step away while still loved is rare and almost never properly noticed. Yet it was there that Kenny Rogers revealed a different kind of courage. Not the courage to stand before thousands of people, but the courage to admit that he had gone far enough, that there are moments when success no longer lies in moving forward, but in knowing when to stop before losing everything. Kenny's disappearance was not an ending. It was a pause, the first space in which he chose to live for things that did not need the spotlight in order to exist. When the stage lights went out, Kenny Rogers stepped into a very different space, one where there were no roles left to shield his exhaustion, no packed schedules to postpone emotion, only time, the body, and the questions that had been pushed aside for many years. Age began to assert itself in ways that could no longer be ignored. His health no longer allowed him to live at the old pace. Long journeys, late nights, back-to-back stages, all of it receded into memory. For the first time in a very long while, Kenny had to learn how to stay still. And that stillness was not entirely comfortable. It forced him to face the fatigue that had accumulated and the psychological scars he had never found the words for. At this point, family became the final test. No longer something to be scheduled between tours, but the center of daily life. Kenny tried to make amends, not through grand gestures, but through steady presence. Evenings at home, unhurried conversations, small moments he had once believed could always be postponed. He understood that some absences could never be filled, but that it was still possible to remain beside those who were there. Kenny's process of healing did not unfold in headlines. There were no emotional declarations, no comeback designed to prove anything. It took place through a slower rhythm of living, slow enough for the body to keep up, slow enough for emotions not to be left behind. He learned to accept that he did not always need to be the storyteller for others. Sometimes what mattered most was listening back to himself. These years did not resemble victory, but they carried a different, quieter value. For the first time, Kenny Rogers was living a life that did not require the spotlight, and still finding it meaningful. After stepping away from his old rhythm of life, Kenny Rogers did not disappear in an absolute sense. He still appeared, but rarely, and always at a different pace. No more extended tours, no more relentless schedules forcing him to prove that he still belonged at the center. Those appearances felt more like gentle greetings than declarations. What changed most clearly was that Kenny no longer lived to meet public expectations. He did not try to preserve the image of the seasoned man audiences had grown used to. The role of star slowly receded, giving way to a simpler life, one in which he was allowed to be tired, allowed to move slowly, and allowed not to tell another story if he didn't need to. In his later years, Kenny chose a quieter existence. Family became a clear priority, no longer standing behind work. Health was placed before the spotlight. He did not seek attention, nor did he avoid memories of the past. Music was still there, but it no longer pulled him away from private life. It became part of a memory that had completed its purpose. Kenny's life philosophy, after all the upheavals, grew remarkably clear and deeply human. He understood that stopping does not equal failure. In many cases, it is a sign of maturity. Knowing when to let go is not about losing the ability to continue, but about understanding well enough what truly deserves to be held on to. Kenny Rogers' continuance does not lie in how long he remained on stage. It lies in the way he stepped away from it without losing himself. When people speak of Kenny Rogers, they often recall the hit songs, the awards, and a career long enough to span generations. But his true legacy cannot be contained within numbers alone. It lies in the way he reshaped what listeners expect a song to do for a human being. Kenny Rogers helped redefine the role of the storyteller in American music. He did not step forward to judge, nor did he try to instruct anyone on how to live. His songs resemble slices of ordinary life, spaces where listeners quietly see themselves reflected. It is precisely that restraint that allowed his music to move beyond the boundaries of country or pop, reaching people who never fully belonged to any genre at all. The Grammy Awards, the millions of listeners, and his secure place in music history are merely outward confirmations of a deeper influence. Kenny proved that music does not need spectacle, nor does it require dazzling technique to reach the most vulnerable parts of the human heart. Sometimes, what allows a song to endure is not its climax, but the feeling of being heard. The greatest value Kenny Rogers left behind was not the image of a flawless star. It was the image of a calm, humane individual, honest enough to speak difficult truths in a very gentle voice. He showed that wisdom does not need to raise its volume, and that depth does not need to be displayed. Kenny's legacy does not demand that people remember his name every day. It simply exists, quietly, in those moments when someone needs a voice slow enough to help them understand themselves a little more. Kenny Rogers' story does not close with a new peak, nor does it end in a tragedy dramatic enough to make the world turn back and stare. It finishes in a quieter way, like someone who has traveled very far, then slowly sets his luggage down, not because he is exhausted, but because he understands what he has been carrying all along. Looking back on that entire journey, perhaps the most memorable thing is not how many awards he received, or how many listeners once leaned in to hear him sing. What lingers longer is a deeply human choice, knowing when to slow down in a world that constantly urges us to move faster. Kenny Rogers' life may not resemble yours, but the feeling of standing between two directions, of going farther or staying to protect what matters, is likely familiar. If you have ever been in such a moment, when success, its expectation, or responsibility pulled you forward too quickly, what did you choose? You don't need to tell the whole story. Just leave a thought, a question, or an unfinished feeling. We will read it, and let it remain. A little while longer,